Jim, you're saying that there's been a lot of focus on leadership, but for you, something has changed about the concept of leadership. What's your view on leadership?
Well, I think I have a lot of views on the subject. I've been thinking and working in the general subject of leadership probably for 40 or 50 years. Uh, it's only been recently that I've begun to appreciate that if you just take the obvious fact that we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on leadership training of various sorts, tens of thousands of books on the subject, uh, 250 million references to the subject in Google, you have to at some point ask yourself the question, uh, are we really evolving in our capacity for leadership? You know, is it working? Are we producing more leaders? Or is whatever the point of leadership about getting translated into some kind of practical reality? And I guess I have the view that the return is pretty slim, if at all, between our investment in leadership development, leadership theory, leadership thinking, leadership books, and the reality about leadership in the world. I think leadership is the almost universal default when people say, what do we need in order to? What do we need in order to turn the thing around? What do we need in order to transform the organization? What do we need to be more competitive? It almost always comes down to we need more leadership. So recently I began to ask myself the question, why is that so? And if you look at what is the most fundamental assumption or assumptions we have as individuals and collectively about leadership, the one that jumps out at me is that leadership at the end of the day is the source of something. It's the cause of something. And specifically, it's rooted in the idea of the individual as the prime leader, as the actor, as the individual that has the special qualities or the special abilities, and is somehow able to inspire people, to mobilize people, to generate a following, generate a movement, etc., etc., etc. And I think to some degree you could say that's legitimate as a story or an explanation or a narrative about what we are kind of observing that we're calling leadership. On the other hand, understanding it that way doesn't seem to be very useful in terms of producing leadership. So I've begun to think about leadership less as about the individual and more about the relationship between people. So I'm beginning to see that leadership never happens if it's only an individual. It always happens in relationship to other people. So you can't have a leader without followers, etc. If it's that way, then leadership becomes more of a social phenomenon rather than some set of attributes that you ascribe to the individual. And if you look at it from that frame of reference, then we could also begin to see that leadership is not about problem solving. Leadership is essentially the part of the conversation we have about how do we create the future, how do we make change happen. I think that's not a bad definition of management. Management's sort of about problem solving, and leadership is more about creating problems worth solving. Or leadership is more about creating possibilities or generating new ideas that get translated into new reality. The other thing that I'm beginning to conclude, if I look at it from that place, is that a more accurate way to say it is the idea of leadership as a social phenomenon combined with the idea that leadership is about creating the future. That it's more grounded and accurate to say it's about co-creating. That together we co-create whatever our future is. We could also be pretty accurate to say, and we have also co-created the way it is now. So co-creation is basically happening all the time. In fact, maybe nothing else is happening except that we're always co-creating our reality. Now, if that's the case, then a lot about leadership is kind of a myth. You know, it's not the truth in terms of how things happen and how things get brought into the world. It's more of an explanation for how that happens, and it's true, I think, that most of our leadership stories are about people who've already produced results. So after history makes Gandhi a leader, we can talk about the Gandhi leadership. And we could almost say that for any leader story that you want to read, that the stories are written after the results. They don't talk about what was there before the results. So I'm interested in what was there before history makes you a leader, or before leadership happens. I'm beginning to think of leadership more as a scoreboard, and it's allowing me to put my focus and attention on what is going on when human beings are co-creating. And among other things, I think you could say that what's occurring is that human beings are expressing themselves, and they're organizing their various talents and concerns in the interest of some particular possibility or some particular opening that is occurring in a particular time in the history of the organization or the society. I would say this is a work in progress. I have no idea where it's going to go, but if it's valid as an entry point and as an access to deeper appreciation for human capabilities and human capacity for leadership, then I think what it begins to do is allow us to do a couple of things. One, begin to take more responsibility for what we've already co-created, and hopefully in doing so minimize or eliminate some of the blame, finger pointing. Secondly, I think that if it begins to reveal that we have many, many, many choices, if we can authentically engage in dialogue and conversation for the sake of building a future together. So that's kind of an overview of kind of where my thinking is. What's exciting me about it, though, is that it allows people to see that what I'm saying is really, we're always in a leadership conversation. We're always co-creating anyway. And mostly we just don't see that because we're so addicted or adapted to thinking about life in terms of the past and the future that we don't actually notice what's going on in the moment. And what's going on in the moment is that every single conversation we have and every single relationship we have, there's something occurring like a dance that's bringing into existence some particular reality or some particular consequence, which then we have to live with, and we can either make another change or we can settle for it, or we can agree that this is the world that we want to build.
On your theory of co-creation, then, why is it that some people seem to rise to the top? Are they more masterful at co-creating?
It's interesting. When you ask the question that way, the first thing that hit me was, am I talking about a theory of co-creation? I would have said that I don't think it's a theory. I think it's just kind of like an obvious observation that any time two human beings are engaged in conversation with each other, or for that matter, when the voice in my head and myself are talking to each other, you know, that what's occurring is a future, that we're always co-creating, and I'm sort of wanting to see that as an observation less than a theory. Now, I also think that people are more or less aware of it in the same way that some people live their lives more in the present than other people do. And I think the more you are oriented to living in the moment, the more you're living in the present, the more obvious it becomes that we are always co-creating. If you're living in your head or you're living in denial of what's going on, you begin to sort of organize life around your point of view rather than organize life around your relationships. And the more you can begin to reconfigure your worldview to include the fact that life is happening all the time. I think there was a guy named Ortega de Gasset, I think he was a priest or something, I'm not sure, who once said the most compelling thing about life is that it's always fired at you point blank. You know, that could be thought of as theoretical or metaphysical, I suppose, but more and more in my life, it's becoming kind of obvious. And I guess the older you get, the more you appreciate that all you have is right now, and that all that's really going on is right now. But if you take that statement literally, and then you say, you know, all that is going on is right now, never mind that it's all I have, and that while intellectually I think a lot of us can conceptually appreciate that life is a series of nows, or life is a series of moments, the way I'm beginning to see it occurring, though, is that pretty much it's all that's going on. And while we have conversations about the past and conversations about causality and conversations about motives and why things happen, there's still conversations that are happening in the moment. And so the appreciation that our ability to influence or impact or inflect the sort of flow of life is really in the moment. You can't take an action in the future, and you obviously can't take an action in the past. You can only take an action in the moment. And the actions that I'm talking about are actions of commitment, action of conversation, actions with respect to how we relate. And in all that reflection, or all those different dimensions and ways of looking at this, more and more I think you find that the ability to co-create is a given. The awareness of that ability is not. And that just as we all have an ability to read, it doesn't mean we're all literate. And I suspect that to answer your question, the more you have at stake, or the more conscious you are of the consequences of your conversations and your relationships with people, the more likely that you will become a, quote, leader in the process of co-creation. But here I'm thinking of leader now as a role, or as an instigator of conversation, rather than a general or somebody that's at the top of the pyramid. We can still have a role of leader, and we can still have authorities, and we can still, by agreement, have different moments in time where we bring our commitments and talents together. But that the phenomenon itself, as I said, to me is looking like just an endless stream of human beings co-creating.
You have an interesting take on corporate approaches to planning. I recall even saying myself that Mitsubishi had a 100-year plan. Is this process of long-term planning out the window?
Well, I don't think this perspective necessarily means anything in terms of what you keep and what you let go of. I think your perspective on horizon or time or future is pretty much a choice. And as long as we're conscious about that and making choices and not being righteous about our choices, I think there's room for all of that. I mean, I love those Japanese stories of 200-year visions. The Jesuits have a 400-year, maybe longer horizon as well, and I think it's probably a healthy perspective in terms of at least giving people a certain amount of serenity that the world is not going to come to an end tomorrow or the sky isn't falling. But I also believe that every corporation that I'm aware of is organizing their commitments and their priorities and their investments, both human investments and financial investments and other resources, on their predictions of the future. And increasingly they're beginning to appreciate that their predictions are very little more than an extension of trends based on their historical performance or results. And as I say, I don't know very many corporations that really trust their predictions, certainly not the way they did 5 or 10 years ago. Now, if you say that the budgeting systems, which are basically the core of any enterprise, are built on the business of predicting, and yet we no longer trust our predictions, which is one of the characteristics I attribute to a real-time world, then what do? Well, I think one of the things you have to do is you have to rethink your relationship to risk, because the need to predict and the attachment we have to predicting historically is because we're trying to control the future. And we try to control the future because we think that the future is variable. And in doing so, we think of that as the way we can minimize or manage risk. What if, and not merely what if, but if you look, I think this is so, that the more accurate way of looking at it is the future is always a risk. There's always a possibility of winning, and there's always a possibility of losing. And no matter what scenario you have, it's still a scenario, and it's still a win-lose kind of outcome, but that really the risk is constant. There's risk of success and there's risk of failure at every moment. So perhaps another way of thinking about this is that risk is constant. And I, the corporation, or we, the corporation, are variable. So the question isn't what will predictably happen, and then what do I think the probabilities and scenarios are to deal with that prediction, but more directly, what future am I wanting to produce, or what am I committed to, and how now do I need to manage my choices in order to have that outcome be on the upside or to be positive. So if I think of myself as variable and the future as constant, I have a very different set of conversations than if I look at myself as constant and think that I can predict, by predicting, control the future, which I believe to be variable. So by making that transformation, or that switch of mindset, you suddenly put the focus on yourself or your own team or your own company and how we are moving in the world and how we are navigating and relating and seeing the world, and spending less time arguing about what we think will or won't happen, and what can we do if, and all those different conversations that are driven by that historical set of budgeting practices.
One more question. You've talked about seeing yourself as variable. What kinds of changes does an individual need to make in order to function within your system? If you're not seeing yourself as a constant, what are you doing? What kind of preparation or change work are you doing on yourself?
Well, that's a big question. And first of all, the idea of whether I'm variable or not is connected to a much larger philosophical reality, which is that for the last 300 or 400 years, the prevailing interpretation of who I am, or who you are, is that we are things, we are objects. And if you believe that, if you accept that assumption, which is usually attributed to Descartes, by the way, then you will invent psychology as a science of how the thing works, or you'll invent management, which is the discipline of how do we control the thing, and you'll end up with many of the institutional conventions that we have around people. I reject that. I don't believe people are things. I think that people are more like possibilities, and a lot of philosophical work has been done by Heidegger and many others to suggest that there is no fact or thing you would call yourself, that the self is a construct. It's not merely a construct you put together individually, because you can't disassociate it from history, and not just recent history, but probably going back to thousands of years. What it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, values in terms of how we interact with the world, all of the different words we use to describe ourselves have basically evolved over human history up to now. Now, there are certain things that you have acquired, thought, believed in your life, and those, generally speaking, fall into the who I think I am category. And again, most of the way we think about ourselves is in this psychological context So it's important to make a distinction between psychology's answer to the question and how I'm answering the question. I'm basically saying I view myself as my relationships. I think that's who I am. I'm my relationship with my little voice in my head. I'm my relationship with other people. I'm my relationship with circumstances. I'm a relationship with time. And I'm a relationship with whatever's outside my understanding. Call it God or universe or the unknown or the mystery. And I'm saying if those 5 relationships don't exist, if you take away any of them, then I disappear. So that's how I see myself. And in that sense, I can begin to see that I don't need to control anything. In fact, I don't think I have much control over anything. I don't have to predict anything, although I can certainly speculate. But I can have a relationship with whatever's occurring. So while I may not have any control over the political situation today, I certainly have a choice in how I relate to it. And while I don't have a lot of choice necessarily about my physical health if something bad happens to me, I have a choice in how I relate to that. And while I don't necessarily have a choice in how you are thinking or what you're doing, I do have a choice in how I relate to you and what you think and what you're doing. So it's the power to navigate in life, in my experience, and increasingly so, is becoming inseparable from my ability to be both aware of and responsible for how I relate to all of it. And the more I do that, the more I realize that myself is mostly a blank canvas. I can more or less continuously reinvent myself. I'm never stuck with, I can't do it because that's not the way I am. I can say I'm not going to do it because I don't want to, or I'm not going to choose to do it, but I don't have to ever blame my behavior or my experience on some kind of an objectified self that I bought into that I think is who I am.